This episode of Troxel is supported by Avail. Content is more than Revit families. If it's digital, Avail can handle it. Learn more at getavail.com. Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel. Well, at episode 50, I said, no time for reflection right now, maybe later. Well, here we are, slowly and then suddenly at 100. In the podcasting universe, this is one I would consider a legitimate milestone, especially when considering that an overwhelming majority of podcasts don't make it past 10 episodes. There is a difference between what this show has become and what I imagined it would be when I launched in June of 2020 during the pandemic, so I wanted to take some time to reflect on that. I created this podcast because it's something that I would have wanted when I was becoming an architect, especially as someone who has always been interested in tools and technology and integrating its use into my practice. And as I grew in leadership, working with consultants, looking at the way businesses are run, the business models, all that stuff. Tapping into brilliant minds of the profession in both tech and architecture and beyond to glean whatever I could along my journey was difficult at best. There were short, cynical Twitter posts. I'm talking about you, Brian Ringley. And of course, there were courses and seminars, but only at a few conferences. In that microcosm of the industry, it wasn't hard to find like-purposed people who were passionate about solving a lot of the industry's problems. It also wasn't hard to see that we were all fighting similar battles because much of the profession remained ignorant of what was and is actually happening, and in many ways pretending it will always be how it has always been. I continue to experience this phenomenon often, which shows that there is still plenty of work to be done. A lot of what is covered on this podcast is still considered by some, many, tangential to the practice of architecture and to the larger building industry. I don't say that to point fingers, but to add some color to the fact that there's still really a lot of work to do. And we here choose to be a part of those who are doing the work, recognizing that if we don't, someone else surely will, and we probably won't like what they come up with. We're not control freaks. No, that's far too negative. We are control enthusiasts. When starting out, I had a few guests in mind, but that list ran out rather quickly, and I was, for a short period, thinking I was done. But like any other design problem, if there's more time, there's more that can be done. And like any decent designer, I decided I was up for the challenge to get outside my comfort zone yet again and cast the net much wider. This has led to where we are today, wide-ranging and far-reaching long-form conversations about the coevolution of architecture and technology. Over the past 100 episodes, I've had the privilege of talking with industry giants and sharing these conversations with you for the benefit of the profession, for all to hear. This is the purpose of the Troxel Podcast, to give you and me hope, to inspire you and me, and to give you and me purpose, and to show that the future is left to those who are willing to roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty. My guests exemplify this ethos. And isn't it amazing to live in a world which is much different than that in which I cut my teeth in, where we can carry so much guidance around in our pockets? This is a good time to remind you that if you point your browser at trxl.co/TED, there is a comprehensive audio library waiting for you, because I don't think of these weekly episodes as things that fade away if you miss them right when they came out. They all fit into the larger story of what I'm doing here and pair well with other thoughts on similar and adjacent topics. This is the resource that I wish I'd had to guide my path from the beginning. Finding ways to surface the information has always been something I've been concerned about when doing an audio show, because traditionally, there hasn't been a search feature for audio-based media. My Troxel episode database landing page is a tool that I made to hopefully get you closer to the content than most other podcasts offer. Again, that's trxl.co/TED. So while this is all great, the business model is rather surprising. The supportive audience via subscriptions and downloads is healthy, but the number of companies willing to support and make the show possible is less than you might think. If you're a regular listener, you know who the companies are that care about what I'm doing here, and for them, I'm grateful. But if you know where I can gain additional support, please send those contacts my way. There is a team of people that make the show possible, and it takes money and resources to do so. My goal is to help as many people as possible overcome the two things our industry suffers through: the way things are and change. If we look at every other profession out there that is literally leaving us in the dust, we cannot argue that our future will be less technologically driven. I believe we can all agree on that. So this podcast exists to help close the gap between who we want to be and who we are, as individuals, as firms, and as a profession. Where does this go from here? Well, I'm always considering ideas on how to make this resource an even more valuable tool for insight and action, and I'm excited to share ways in which that will happen as time goes on. But for now, I'm truly thankful for your attention. I know it's valuable, and my goal is to make it even more valuable so you too can help elevate the industry wherever you are in your career. Thank you for making these last 100 episodes possible. It has vastly exceeded my expectations on the kind of impact I thought this podcast could ever have. I also want to remind you that I rely exclusively on my listeners to share the podcast with others, so please do send it to one or two people who you think would benefit from what I'm doing here. Obviously, the content is free, so there shouldn't be any pushback there, and your help in this manner truly cannot be understated. The future of the show, in some ways, is entirely dependent on your willingness to do so. Also, if you have someone in mind who you'd like to hear on the show, go to trxl.co/TED and click the Suggest a Guest button just below the list of people who have already been on the show. I love getting these recommendations, and many episodes that have been published have come from listener referrals. As always, thank you so much for listening and for your interest in helping make a positive impact in the industry as we examine the coevolution of architecture and technology. In this episode, I welcome Paul Wintour. Paul is the founder of Parametric Monkey, a computational design consultancy focused on BIM and digital fabrication. Paul holds an MArch from the Architectural Association's Design Research Laboratory and has taught at the University of Technology, Sydney, the University of New South Wales, the Queensland University of Technology, the University of Hong Kong, and the Architectural Association. In this episode, which was inspired by Paul's recent blog posts, we discuss his description of the gap that exists in the profession between innovation and adoption, just how far behind we really are and how much work there is to do to catch up, technical debt in practice, the reality that most tools that are developed in firms are incomplete and unused, transactions versus relationships, recalibrating practice, and more. This was a fantastic conversation with Paul, and I hope you'll not only find value in it for yourself, but that you'll help add value to the profession by sharing it with your network. I also encourage you to share it with firm leadership. So without further ado, I bring you my wide-ranging conversation with Paul Wintour. Paul, welcome to the podcast. Great to meet you. I'm excited about this. You've been on fire lately. I have the fire emoji in my head right now because of the blog posts that you've been writing. And I want to really focus on two today. We started off with technical debt and then incomplete and unused. These hit home for me as a digital practice leader at my previous firm that I was at, but also, this is a lot of these things are just ignored in firms today, and this is, I think, kind of a wake up call for those. And so I would love it if you would, let's just start off and define what you see as kind of the thesis. Like, there's definitely an underlying thesis to these articles, and if you want to just kind of kick it off and tell us where you're coming from and who your audience is, because I know it's not necessarily the users, although I know it is in some, but it's also leadership, right? So,
yeah. So, I started Parametric Monkey around 5 years ago as a consultancy. The blog had been running much longer than that. And a lot of what I wanted to write about was getting better with how we deal with technology. So I think, a lot of people in the industry would agree with the statement that architecture and technology are converging, but how we actually manage and use technology hasn't evolved a lot. And what tended to happen was that a lot of the companies would they would promote the use of their tools and their workflows. They didn't get into a lot of the nitty-gritty. It was a lot of marketing. And I was just listening to Matt Wash's podcast with you, which kind of said that, there's probably only one person in the company that was probably using that software or that workflow. So I was kind of really interested in having an honest discussion about technology. So, things that weren't working, that, projects that did go wrong. And so much of that just gets sort of covered up. So these sort of articles were, a lot of them come from my own personal experience. And also through our consulting work, we get to work with lots of practices, not just in Australia, but international. And so there's recurring themes. And so I think it's important that we have this discussion so that we can actually get better with using technology.
One of the kind of boiling points, or maybe this was just where you're having a lot of these conversations, is with the document that you co-authored with the Australia Institute of Architects called BIM and Beyond: Design Technology and Architecture. It sounds like you were doing a lot of kind of reconnaissance and talking with people as you're doing the survey and able to dig a little bit deeper than just kind of typical survey questions. Is that kind of how some of these topics came to the surface, or is it even bigger than that? Is that because you referenced it in both articles, and it seems like those are these are some things that were coming out of that report?
The background of that sort of commission is they had already done the survey. So we weren't involved in the actual framing of the questions. But once they had collected all the responses, kind of synthesizing those, results and trying to work out what the underlying cause of a lot of that was. And it was pretty interesting. So it goes beyond just kind of tallying up how many people said yes or no, but understanding why. So, one of the things that we asked about was emerging technologies. So often practices, only a handful of them will engage in emerging technologies. And by that, I mean digital fabrication, robotic fabrication, AI, robotics, all of those sort of things. But there was kind of quite a big uptake in digital fabrication. And what's happening behind the scenes is that there was a lot of governments, state governments, that are starting to introduce DFMA frameworks for government projects. So namely schools. We start to see these trends, and it's not necessarily driven by the architects wanting to get involved in it, but rather of a demand where if they want to be competitive and be a part of these commissions, they're starting to have to learn these kind of new skills. So yeah, certainly through the Australian Institute of Architects survey, we got a broad picture of the industry. In some ways, it was a little bit skewed in that the people that were already using technology were probably the most likely to respond to the survey. So I dare say that, a lot of people that weren't interested in BIM or any sort of technology didn't respond to the survey. So some of those numbers are a bit skewed. But also in parallel with that, we were doing a lot of consulting work with architecture offices around their digital strategy. So, the software they were using, how many technical staff they would have. And, you could start to kind of piece those pieces together where at one level you have an industry-wide response or trend, and then seeing individual practices, all of the details about why they're struggling to make things work.
It's interesting to think about the purpose of this report. I'm wondering if you even know what it is. Is it just to expose kind of the pulse of the industry and where it's at with technology, or is it to coax people along in adoption? One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is kind of the innovators innovating on innovation curve, which it goes up and to the right. And because that's their mindset, that's what that's the startup, that might be a design technology group inside a firm, but they're kind of ever improving, leapfrogging, going up. And then there's this adoption curve, which is way lower, way flatter. And so the gap between those gets fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter. And the question then is like, how will we ever overcome that? And so is that kind of the purpose behind doing a report like this, is just to expose that kind of information to a larger audience and get firm leadership thinking about that and addressing it more critically, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think it had two purposes. I think the first one is around benchmarking the industry. So, getting a pulse for where we're at. And organizations, really value that. They want to know how they rate compared to their competitors. And I think the second thing the report was trying to do was to really define a roadmap about how organizations can get better. And so part of that is to, have the conversation not with the design technology people, but to move it up into kind of management and leadership so that we can start to have discussions about, how to actually monetize these skills, about where the industry is headed, about how we're going to train future staff. And so I think it kind of succeeded on that level. It takes a long time to do a report of this size. So, it was probably a year in the making. So I guess by the time you finish that report, you probably need to start all over again because, you're a year on.
Update it.
Yeah, but I'm sure it won't be the last BIM survey in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it is critical information to understand. I think one of the things you point out in one of your articles is the term that showed up on Harvard Business Review, right, which was innovation theater, right? And this idea of firms positioning themselves in marketing as technologically advanced, or cutting edge, maybe bleeding edge, even just because it looks a certain way to a particular client or to peers in the industry. And what's interesting, you think about these firms and the survey comes out and who's going to answer the questions. And I think something else you point out in one of those articles was, I think it was in the Incomplete and Unused, was that a BIM manager gets assigned to fill out this information. And a lot of times a BIM manager is going to come back with information that the leadership is completely unaware of. All of the tools that they've developed, the things that they're using, in air quotes, right? Because just because they have it doesn't necessarily mean they're using it. And even if they are using it, it might only be one or two people in the office, right? So there's a huge disconnect between leadership and marketing, I guess, and the actual users and the actual outcomes of the processes and the repetitive nature that those processes require to get better and more embedded in a firm. I'm just wondering, kind of, as I spew all that out, I know you have thoughts on all that stuff, but there's a big gap there between all of those various pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, the whole leadership in kind of architecture, the way that I like to think of it is, it takes a generation to change. So, the people in leadership now, even their design style, they're perfecting a style or a practice that they learnt, 30, 40 years ago. And so, by the time, someone of my age, gets to that kind of leadership practice, we'll want to be practicing what we were taught. So, there's actually probably a 30 or 40 year gap between the technology and the thinking and sort of the execution and the management of that. And so the companies that are doing really well with technology are the ones where leaders play an active role with technology. Now, the people that I speak of, they probably learned CAD and they probably haven't touched it for 20 years. They don't know anything about Revit and work sets and all that kind of stuff, but they have the conversation. And, that makes a huge difference because they don't need to know everything, but they have the discussion and they know how to use people and their skills to improve how the business is being run. The ones that are struggling are the ones that kind of hire one person, a BIM manager, because the industry says you need a BIM manager. And then everything technical just gets delegated to them. But the reality is that delegation doesn't mean much because they don't have a lot of ownership or authority to make decisions. So, yes, they're responsible for the day-to-day solving of problems, but, can they spend money? Can they buy software? Do they have an allowance? Can they restructure teams? Can they organize training as they see fit? Probably not. That all has to get escalated to management. And so, they don't have a lot of autonomy in how they're actually running technology within the company. So it's still very much a siloed discipline that's supporting architecture rather than an integrated, design technology team.
Yeah, I absolutely see that all over the place. And then there are examples of very successful teams and firms who do the things that you're talking about, right? There are the ones who have technologists in leadership positions who are sitting at the table strategically for the direction of the company, and they're proactive about it versus this kind of reactive, siloed. And it is interesting to think about, and you brought this up in an article. I definitely keep giving you credit for this because you do tick a lot of the boxes in here when it comes to kind of explaining all of these different pieces. But talking about that mindset of architecture is a digital practice nowadays versus it's architecture with digitally supporting technologists who may be on the payroll, or maybe they're a hired consultant, right? Those are two very different ways to run a company today.
When I consult with companies, we go through a series of questions, and one of them is based on Donald Rumsfeld's famous quote about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So, there are things that we don't know. We know that they'll happen, but we don't know exactly what they are. So, take, for example, someone's going to retire. We know that will happen, but we don't know necessarily who or when, or we know someone will go on maternity leave, but, we can't predict that. And as we kind of go through this, we start to look at, okay, well, where is the profession headed? And one of the, I guess, known unknowns is that, okay, architecture and technology will continue to converge. And we say, okay, well, what does that mean? And it's like, okay, well, we know that we'll be using technology. Maybe it's Revit and BIM, or maybe it's something else. We don't know, but we know that it's going to play a bigger and bigger part in what we're doing. And then you get, further down the questionnaire and we start talking about, okay, well, how are you enabling digital within your teams? And then the answer is often, well, we have a department that does that, or we have this person that is responsible for digital. And so there's this disconnect between, on the one hand, they know the profession is becoming more digital and we have to become more savvy with how we use technology. But on the other hand, the way that they're structuring teams, that they're hiring, how they're delegating tasks, is that we have the architects or the designers, and then we have the technical support crew. And so it's really trying to sort of highlight to them and say, look, these are your words that you said the industry was happening, but this is what you're actually doing. So how can we reconcile those two perspectives. And, that may come in a variety of ways, right? So that might be training, it might be hiring, it might be remuneration. It may just be having just, different types of discussions on Monday mornings. But organizations don't necessarily understand that discrepancy unless you can point it out, using their own kind of, words and responses.
And there's so many firms who have pushed off this idea of in-house training. You've got to do it on your own time. I mean, it's not even said, right? It's just expected. You're going to do it on your own time. You're going to do it on nights and weekends. You're going to, step up to the challenge. And I don't care how you do it. You're just going to do it, versus this idea of actually doing that work of creating that in-house training team or hiring somebody to come in and do the training consistently. It's interesting to think about it from that point of view, because if the gap is really getting bigger, if people are saying one thing but doing another, what are you seeing from firms that are actually handling this well? I mean, how are they bridging the gap? I mean, one of the things you talk about in the article is actually training the middle managers to, you mentioned it earlier in the conversation, right? Training people on not only what's possible, like you don't want them to learn how to use the software. Your goal is not to get them to be proficient, but the goal is to get them to be aware of what's going on, both on the good, but also the struggles inside the software that people are dealing with. Because if they don't understand that, I mean, something that my mind keeps going back to as you're talking is this misalignment of incentives. Like, typically, there's leadership and management that are incentivized by one thing, which is, more clients, bigger projects, on time, on budget, put the hours wherever they can to make it look the best, and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the people who actually have to do the work, and they don't want to stay nights and weekends, so they're going to take shortcuts, right? And so that's where this idea of technical debt comes into play, which is there's a disconnect of what the problems really are with the software. There's a lot of them. I mean, and I think it's also an issue where the younger staff is not speaking up because they don't want people to know that it's not working correctly, or there's definitely kind of a communication problem there, both directions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of issues happening at multiple levels of the organization that are contributing to the issue. So, when I think from my own practices, working as an architect, the way that I learned AutoCAD was sitting next to someone who was, the CAD manager, asking him lots of questions and bugging them. And he once told me, I said to him, I'm sure you get really annoyed me asking you loads and loads of questions. And he goes, well, sort of, but I will always answer you, because if I don't, I know that you're going to go off and do, a dirty hack that will come back to bite us. And so he took the effort to solve issues then and then, because he knew, they would become even more problematic down the track. And then so, you fast forward a few years and, working within a team, you can look over your shoulder and you can see someone doing something, very tedious in a slow and painful way. And, I remember showing one interior designer how to use BIMlink, to help with her scheduling of furniture and things like that. And her mind was blown. And it's like, what was taking, days. And this was a project that was under serious pressure and was behind schedule and was one of those, toxic projects. It just took someone who knew the software to sit beside them and go, okay, well, here's an obvious savings. But that only happened because I was embedded in the team. And a lot of organizations, they have a design technology department. They may be physically separated, sit in the corner in their own area. I remember visiting WeWork several years ago, and there was a big sign up going, welcome to IT, please turn around and submit a ticket request. And so there was this attitude, even in other organizations where if you want to ask a question, submit a ticket, we'll put it in a queue. And then, in 3 or 4 days later, we'll get back to you. And, that makes sense from a software development side of things. And IT people will continue to push that as a way of operating. But when you're dealing with architects that, have to get drawings out that day, they're not going to wait around 3 or 4 days for an answer. So if you don't answer them, they're going to do a hack. So I think, anything that you can do where you can identify problems as quick as possible. So, again, Matt Walsh mentioned in his podcast about the, Toyota production system around, stopping that production line as soon as you discover something. So, in the past, we've done, quite a few initiatives. One that worked really well was, based on the idea of a Genius bar. So you go into an Apple store, you make your 15-minute appointment, and they'll answer any questions you want and show you how to do it. And the issue that we were having at the organization at the time was, there had been a lot of new people and they arrive and they don't necessarily know who to ask. Well, what to ask, but also more importantly, who to ask. So firstly, they have to have a problem that they're trying to solve. And then the second issue is they need to find in an organization of 200 when they've only just been there a month, who the best person to ask is. So how do you know who the best person is for door schedules? Or how do you know who the best person is to speak about, how to create a family or something like that? And so we set up, for 1 hour, people could make a request and say, I have a question about X, Y, and Z. And then we would match them with the expert in the office so that for 15 minutes they could sit down and they could learn a particular topic. So that was an example of being proactive in kind of solving those issues. It wasn't about a Revit dashboard or, telling them what they had done wrong, but going, if you have a problem, we will connect you to the right people so that you can improve and get better with, whatever it is you need to be doing. And that ranged from, Photoshop, Illustrator through to, Python and C# and everything in between. Like we had a lot of experts, and all they had to offer was, probably 15 minutes, 30 minutes a week of their sort of time.
Yeah, those are two completely different approaches, right? I think about it in terms of transactions versus relationships. And I worked for Apple for a little bit, and the story of the Genius Bar brings me back to something that they drilled into us early on, which was the difference between, and this was early on in the Apple Store days, but it was probably 2008, something like that. And right after the iPod came out, things like that. And the difference between an Apple Store and a Best Buy, and I don't know if you have Best Buy in Australia or not, but Best Buy is just like a consumer electronics store. Okay. And so the idea was at Best Buy, if you go in and buy a Mac, right, and this is the whole reason Apple started the Apple Store was to create the experience that they wanted to control for people who were buying a computer. And you go into a Best Buy, you pick one up off the shelf, you walk up to the register, you pay for it, and they said, that's a transaction. The relationship is over. Done, right? The Apple Store attitude was, you buy a computer and we begin a relationship. Why? Because we want you to get the most out of your computer. Because why? We want you to come back and buy another one at some point. But between now and then, however long that is, we want you to get the most you can out of it. How is that going to happen? We're going to teach you, right? So they had the Genius Bar, to your point. They had all these other different things that they offered a customer. And I thought it was fundamental, the approach, right? Which was the difference between a transaction and creating a relationship. I mean, and it's funny, right? It's a relationship with a store. It's a relationship with maybe a staff member or two or three at a store, but still that could happen, that they could change a customer's attitude. And obviously it's been wildly successful. And that's probably a big piece of why it's been successful. But to do that in a firm is equally, the analogy holds up, right? To connect the right person with the right person and be able to, in 15 minutes, learn how to do something that it would have taken you 4 hours to find on Google and YouTube and go through all the various, and you end up shopping for shoes, right? Every time. So it's something that happens because there's so many distractions out there. Those are two completely different attitudes. And for a firm to recognize that those connections matter inside the company to facilitate, and that somebody can actually facilitate those. Submitting a ticket to IT is a transaction. Finding the right person, a project architect, a BIM manager, it doesn't matter who, to create a relationship there actually builds a culture in your company that can overcome these kinds of problems. Let's take a quick break to share more about our sponsors. My friends, I've got a new chapter in the Avail story to tell you about, and that is the newly released version of Avail Desktop 4.3. The people behind Avail continually strive to make things easier for you. Easier to find the information you're looking for, easier to get it into your preferred application, and easier to store it in your preferred cloud storage locations. Let's face it, I think we can all agree that easier is better. But they didn't stop there. They also care about what your experience is like. So, as always, they've kept their focus on visuals with an eye toward design and ease of use. You're probably dying to hear the details of what's new. Well, who am I to get in the way? So let's get right to it. Avail Desktop 4.3 will now feel like your own custom app thanks to keycards. Keycards are data-driven and create zippy new visual ways of organizing your existing content. Think of them like pivot tables for your content. Join the Avail Desktop 4.3 party in BYOS or bring your own storage. Now you can store and deliver your content using Autodesk's BIM 360, Microsoft's OneDrive, Microsoft SharePoint, Google Drive, Dropbox, Ignite, and others. Avail's new dynamic paths feature also solves the problem of accessing content using desktop connectors like Autodesk Desktop Connector. Try it today. Either bug your admin to update your installation for all the new goodies, or if you aren't currently using Avail, go to getavail.com today to learn more. That's getavail.com. And now let's get back to our conversation.
There's another example you were asking about, organizations that are doing it well and organizations where there's room for improvement. We do a lot of software workshops. So, whether that's kind of Rhino, Revit or Grasshopper or Dynamo. And, with some organizations, it's like the moon landing. So it has to be timed at when there's no deadlines, when they're not too busy, where, people are not away on holidays, it gets scheduled in months in advance and, the participants are curated on, who deserves it and, who doesn't. And, then there's another organization where, people do guerrilla workshops. So someone goes, I know Python, I'm going to run, lunchtime, lunch and learn sessions. And the organization got 60 people wanting to learn Python on the first day. And, no one organized that top down. It was all kind of bottom up. The organization supports it through, whether it's a free lunch or taking an hour out of your workday, whether that's beers after work, whatever that involves, they're like, if you take the initiative to make it happen, we will kind of support that. And so if you can get, a handful of people all sharing their own expertise, whether that's Python, whether that's Revit, whether it's Photoshop, very soon you start to change the culture about learning and how we discuss technology. And you start to also learn about, who these key individuals are that you can ask for help to help you on your kind of journey.
Right. Yeah, I mean that is huge to enable that to happen, to give people the agency in a company to be that resource, right? Because I think a lot of people are waiting around for permission to do that, but you called it guerrilla kind of tactics, right? There seems to be a bit of agency there, so that would have to be kind of modeled. It seems like for people to feel like they just have permission to do that without explicit permission. It's interesting. I wanted you to define technical debt and why this is such, you call it architecture's ticking time bomb. So I would love to get into that topic with you.
Yeah. So, I mean, technical debt, comes from the software industry. It doesn't only relate to software or architecture. I'm sure that every industry or profession is facing similar issues. But it's the fact that, taking shortcuts today means more work tomorrow or down the track. So it's a very simple sort of concept. And I think we all know intuitively that it makes sense, that if we do something quick and dirty, then when we come to update it, and there is always changes in our industry, is that it's going to be twice as much work. And so you get almost like negative compound interest, where you just keep digging yourself deeper and deeper into this technical debt hole. And, I think what helped me articulate the problem, I think, a lot of people, it will resonate with them through their own experiences, but just working with practices, organizations, and digging down into some of those projects that have gone horribly wrong. And, there's kind of comments that come back and go, I don't know why the project went so bad, because it's actually relatively simple, from a architectural, technology point of view. But you can just see this kind of chain reaction of, things that have gone wrong, right? And it probably starts right at the beginning in the feasibility or the competition phase, where, people they just want to get it done. They don't necessarily care how it was modeled. So they do quick and dirty, sort of hacks. The project might go on hold. That competition team moves on to another team or another project. Then the documentation team comes in for the real project. And, after being on hold for so long, there's probably a we need it tomorrow mentality. So maybe they don't, rebuild things or start from scratch. So you're already kind of behind the eight ball. The BIM manager, there's only one in the organization, and they are not a part of the project kickoff. So they can't go, oh, hang on, we should redo this or restructure it this way. And by the time that happens, that project has progressed so far that it's one of the BIM managers said to me, if I had have tried to fix it, I would have done more harm than good. So it got to a point where things were so broken, then they just had to sort of accept it. And so, then there's people start getting frustrated, and they're like, why am I working all this overtime on this project that's just, crap? And so they ask to be taken off the project. And so no one else wants to go on it. So then they hire new people. And so, new people come in and go, I'm going to change the world, or, fresh start and make my mark. And then, the cycle kind of repeats. And if you do that enough times, it gets to a point where there's no one left on the project that can remember how that project was done a certain way. So all of that knowledge about why things are the way that they are and the history of decision-making is gone. Either they've left the organization or they're on another project. And so then you're into this tipping point where you can't go back. You've got a whole host of compounding errors, and you're chasing your tail because you don't know what's right and what's wrong, because the people that you should be able to turn to and ask for guidance are no longer there. You're surrounded by people that have been on the project for 1 or 2 months only. And so the only thing left to do is really just to, it's like that marathon runner just kind of crawling over the finish line. They just want to get it done and that's it. The next project will be different. But as we know, history tends to repeat.
Yeah. I'm looking for a tweet that I responded to or forwarded from somebody I follow on Twitter. And it was interesting because she's an author and she wrote her and her husband, her husband has been on this show early on. And they wrote a book on quarantine and pandemic. And it was interesting. They were writing this book before any of that actually happened. So it was kind of interesting timing because it totally applies to this. The idea that this negative compounding interest is because we refuse to improve our processes, seeing those as a business advantage, right? I mean, there's just this constant reactionary cycle. You talk about the staff who's responsible for putting out the work on the deadline. And so their incentive is to not work overtime, right? And so of course they're going to take shortcuts. Are they going to tell everybody about the shortcuts they're taking? Of course they're not going to tell everybody about the shortcuts. And then when somebody has to come back and fix it, they have to reverse engineer the shortcuts, which takes magnitudes of time longer than actually doing it right the first time. So here we go. If I can find my damn tweet. Sorry, this is painful here for me to find it because Twitter doesn't make it easy. Oh, terrible. Terrible that I can't find this. Okay, here we go. It's a tweet by Nicola Twilley. Nicola Twilley. It says, quarantine is a tool that we know we will need again. Its flaws, challenges, potential for injustice, etc., are revealed every time we use it. They're flexible. They are fixable, but we haven't, and won't because no one wants to think about pandemics after a pandemic. So my analogy here is replace quarantine with the BIM process and replace pandemic with project, right? So the BIM process is a tool we know we will need again. Its flaws, challenges, potential for injustice are revealed every time we use them, but they're fixable, but we haven't, and we won't because no one wants to think about projects after a project, right? We're automatically thinking about the next project as soon as a project is over, and the process doesn't get any better because we don't find it fundamental to our business. And it's so interesting to think about technology and support as a silo within a company when it is the only way we deliver projects today. And it is the way we do business. And to think of those two things as separate is absolute failure on leadership's part in a company.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in the business of architecture. I got to the point in my career where it's like, I know how to do architecture. I know how to do technology. The challenge now is not a technical or a design related issue, but it's getting broader support from everyone so that we can actually make it happen. So it's really shifting from, say, an individual focus to more of a sort of a collective focus. And if we think about how people are remunerated, in their annual reviews or bonuses, most of the time, it's the people that work long hours, that, get projects done, that are kind of rewarded. And that tends to further ingrain this notion that projects have to take a long time, that you have to work a lot of overtime in order to become successful. But if you think about, well, who should actually be rewarded? The person that finishes at 5 o'clock and is super efficient, or the person that does the same amount of work that finishes at 10 p.m., on the face of it, one looks like, they're leaving on time or early and is not a team player. But the person that stays late, has dinner and, is not 100% focused on the project, is seen more favorably. And so, there were a few moments in my career where I sort of said, this is wrong, right? Just because someone is more efficient doesn't mean that they're not a team player and they shouldn't be kind of held back. So I think, and, when we start to look at how architecture is becoming more digitized, we can see that same sort of bias in software. So, companies will be happy to spend, I say happy, but, they're willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars on consulting fees because they know, that requires a lot of bums on the seat and there's a lot of, hours that are going to be needed to do it. But if you presented a second option and said, okay, well, this software can do the exact same thing, and it's also, and it's going to do it in 5 minutes instead of 5 months, is that worth more, less, or the same as the consulting? And so most people, they would have a reluctance. They wouldn't spend a couple of $1 million on software. That's absurd. I can get, Google for $10 a month or something like that, or Netflix for $10 a month. Why would I spend, $1 million on software? But, if you compare like for like, it's like, well, actually it should be worth more because you're doing it in 5 minutes instead of 5 months. So, not only are you saving, well, maybe you're not saving any money, but you're saving, 5 months worth of labor. So, but people don't have that kind of perspective. So I think there's a recalibration that's needed about, what does efficiency look like? And I'm not sure how we get to that. I think, the way, I guess my part in this puzzle is really just to, put out articles that hopefully, stimulate some discussion, and, hopefully find its ways into, the right type of people reading it, that we can, have meaningful discussions in rethinking how we actually run projects because, they certainly aren't the most efficient at the moment.
I started my career in architecture as a designer. I worked my way up to a senior design position. And then there's this giant gaping hole in the organization that technology was a silo. It was reactive. There was no strategic anything going on. And internally or externally. Marketing loved innovation theater. It was very much like we're doing simulation, we're doing all of these things. When to your point, there was one user in the firm who left, who was doing simulation, right? And so I moved over to digital practice, created this group, and I feel like the success that we saw in digital practice came from my background as a designer and seeing this as a design problem within the organization. And I don't think very many firms or practices or leaders or think of it that way. I don't think that we think of ourselves, our organization, as a design problem. And it's a continually evolving design problem. It's never done, right? The organization is never done being designed. And I'm just curious, as we wrap up here, like, what are your thoughts about that kind of approach or just that kind of a mindset and what you see out there? Because I think very much is in alignment with the things that you're talking about. You're bringing these things up. You're trying to get these ideas out there. You're writing these articles to stimulate these conversations, but really like to put our money where our mouths are, or to put rubber on the road, right? Like for all the cliches that we can come up with, that you've got to actually act. You have to do equally or more than what you say you're doing. Like instead of saying it up front, just to say it, innovation theater style, just do it and then talk about the outcomes later, right? And whether they're good or bad, because we do need to learn from our mistakes. But I feel like so much of this if we reframe our own organizations as design problems, that's at least a starting point, because we're architects. Like we're damn good problem solvers. We can solve these problems. I know we're focused on our clients. We're focused outwardly much more than we're focused inwardly, but at least it's a beginning to start to reframe how we approach these kinds of issues, because as you mentioned earlier, like there are so many intertwined issues. It's actually difficult to find the right place to start, but we have to start.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good quote which says, it's out of Harvard Business Review again, around, strategies and what you say you do, it's what you actually do. So yes, you can put in whatever mission statements, you want, but ultimately what you do is your strategy. So if you want to invest in a certain type of project or topology or whatever that is, where you spend your time and energy is your strategy. So I think certainly organizations need to get better at doing what they say they do. I think what's helped me a lot and maybe give me a bit of street cred is, I am an architect by training, and I come from it from a perspective of helping the project. So I think sometimes if you're more from a technician background, there can be a bit of adversary between kind of the leadership about, well, I don't want to be told what to do by a technician. Like, this should be design led and, we're interested about the project and that sort of things. And so, having worked with kind of, I guess, well-known architects, is that you're approaching it from yes, it's a technical solution, but the goal is to actually improve the project. And I think if you can start to reframe conversations that way, you're going to get much more buy-in. So one of the, I guess, eye-opening moments for me was that through our consulting work, we work with architects, engineers, manufacturers and contractors, is that they all have a different, let's say, bias in that, that triangle of, good, fast, cheap. Okay. So, for a contractor, and by contractor, I mean, general contractor, subcontractor, manufacturer, saving time is of huge importance, because of all the preliminaries and, the overheads. But when you talk to an architect, saving time is not high on their agenda. It's around improving the, the design outcome. So I'm actually working on another article, which I'm not sure when it will be released, but I've been reflecting about kind of why I got into BIM. So the article is called BIM 2.0, and it's about next generation BIM. And, the way that I see it is, we wouldn't use, Windows NT anymore, or, we wouldn't use technology or a Nokia phone or a BlackBerry that's, 20, 30 years old. So, why are we using BIM technology that's 37 years old, right? At a minimum. So, Revit's been around, a long time, 22, 23 years. So what we have now is probably not where BIM is going to get to. So what does that next era look like? And that got me thinking about, well, why did I get into BIM in the first place? And I can remember the first project I took to contract documentation. I was a third year architecture student. It was my first project using CAD. Everything else was hand-drawn. So it's quite funny because I worked for a company where they were a late adopter of CAD. And then I kind of, leapfrogged and went all the way from BIM to computational design in a matter of years. So I was learning CAD, but I was also learning how to actually document a building. And all of the door and window schedules were done manually, probably through Excel or measuring off drawings. And I actually mixed up some of the widths and heights on some of the windows. And it's just for a house, but, they're timber framed windows. So, quite expensive and, handmade and things like that. And I'm not dyslexic. I was just, a third year student, and there was, failures of quality assurance at all levels, from myself to my boss to the actual, contractor. And somehow a few of these got built as they were scheduled rather than as they were drawn. Now, you could argue about, okay, what's the order of precedence and how that all works. But, what I ended up having to do is I had to tell my boss, and he's like, okay, well, you got to go out there at 5 a.m. onto site tomorrow and explain it to a very grumpy builder. And then we have to work out what we're going to do. And so I had to redesign the windows so that we could, use this one over here and that one over here. And we had to change the design so that we didn't have to remake these windows. And it was a pain in the ass, right? Like it was stressful. My boss was annoyed. The builder was annoyed. The client was annoyed. And, something like Revit mostly eliminates that problem. Okay. We can have scheduling. And so then you fast forward, 15 years, and you're sitting next to a interior designer who's doing all of their furniture schedules in Excel because it's quicker and easier. And so, I tell them that story, and you go, look, I will take the time to teach you how to use, the scheduling in Revit, because I know that, a simple mistake can, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars of errors. So I think when you bring in that kind of real world experience about this is why we have standards, because stuff has gone wrong and it will go wrong again in the future. They start to just see it as not a BIM manager, stamping their feet going, you must do it this way, but there's a reason why we're doing it the way that we're doing it.
Yeah. There's something that reminds me of when I was doing all this was there's a lot of pushback from staff where you're talking about standards and they see it as handcuffs. Oh, because I ultimately want design freedom at all levels, at every step along the way. And I want to be able to, do whatever. And the message really had to turn into, no, it's not handcuffs, it's freedom. These standards are freedom to give you back the time to do the things that actually matter, right? And that mindset shift is huge in a firm. And it's very difficult to get across, messaging wise, communication wise, to really understand the value of why we do it this way. And a firm on many levels has to have those kinds of efficiencies built in, it's not just because of the problems, but because of the timelines and because of everything the things that our business is built on. It's very, it is a difficult problem to deal with when I think every firm at some level is dealing with kind of the Wild West nature of standards and adherence or non-adherence to those standards. It's interesting to think about. It's a tough problem to crack for sure.
Yeah, I heard of another project where, on their site plan, they had dimensioned to an existing retaining wall on site. So they didn't use, absolute coordinates, but it was a relative coordinate or relative dimension from something existing. And what happened was, during that time the survey was done and they were going through their design process, that wall had been demolished and it had been rebuilt in a different location. And, the builder got on and they set out their project and, the entire building was built in the wrong location. And it was just from, a simple mistake. But, these sort of stories companies are often very reluctant to talk about because, they don't want to admit mistakes. They don't want to be held liable. But it's through these stories that we actually learn and go, oh, okay, well, maybe that's why we lock down certain models or we have a Q&A process or QA process. So I think, in general, we just need to be much more honest and open about not only that innovation theatre, but also the things that don't work and that have gone horribly wrong, because it's the failures that we learn from, not necessarily our successes.
I can't wait to read about BIM 2.0 from your perspective. This is going to be fantastic. I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation today. There's so many more things I think that we could talk about. So maybe we'll do a 2.0 episode of our own at some point. But is there, obviously I'll have links to your social feeds, your website. Where can people follow along with what you're writing, what you're publishing online, where they can see what you're up to?
Yeah, so all of the articles are on parametricmonkey.com. Also, through kind of LinkedIn. So we're also creating new software which deals with hopefully a lot of these issues, called metricmonkey.io. So keep an eye out for that. And hopefully, that will be a step in the right direction towards BIM 2.0.
Fantastic. Paul, thank you so much for spending the time with me today. I really, really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Evan.
Thank you to Avail for their support of this podcast episode. Visit getavail.com to see their holistic approach to content management today. This show is part of the Gabled Media Podcast Network. You can see all the shows at gabledmedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what I'm doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and of course, share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at trxl.co/podcast, where you can find every episode. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Just search for eTroxel. Talk to you soon.